Salam and peace be upon you. I begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Good evening and thank you for joining. My name is Kanis Sivji, and on behalf of the Organization for Islamic Learning, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second night of our annual Ramadan lecture series. The Organization for Islamic Learning, OIL, is a charitable nonprofit community-based group that strives to build a membership whose main goal is to understand and practice the essence of Islam in an inclusive environment. We promote learning activities based on the teachings of the Quran and the value of its prophet and family. We hold and participate in lectures, seminars, workshops, and retreats in hopes of enhancing the spiritual growth of our members. Today's session is the second in a 3 consecutive day lecture series event titled Trekking for Unity, the Abraham Path Initiative, a journey towards God and each other. Today's lecture will continue exploring how walking the Abraham path is both a metaphysical and physical exercise. There are numerous stories about Abraham throughout monotheistic history, which our speaker, Anisa Mehdi, will share. These stories will show how Abraham's struggle and our subsequent desire to follow in his path require the same elements we strive to nurture within ourselves during Ramadan: discipline, dedication, connection, and reflection. Anisa will also share her experiences at Hajj and show us clips from her productions over the years. We will see the transformations that occurred, and she will describe how the structural changes there still result in similar experiences for pilgrims. Before I introduce our main speaker, to continue our lecture series, I'd like to first invite Mikhail Nakvi, a member of our youth committee, who will read a passage from the Holy Quran. Mikhail?
Assalamu alaikum. Tonight we continue our conversation during these blessed but heavy nights. Imam Ali alayhi salam's tragic murder and subsequent death weighs heavily on us all. In the dawn of the 19th of Ramadan, Ibn al-Mujim, one of the Kharijis, struck with his poisoned sword on Imam Ali's head while the Imam was in sajda. He died 2 days later. The night of the 21st of Ramadan is a night of the revelation of the quiet Quran and the night of the martyrdom of the speaking Quran, Imam Ali alayhi salam. Last night, my fellow youth committee member Alicia spoke about Surah Qadr. There are 3 other surahs recommended to be mentioned in this holy time of this holy month. Surah Ankabut, which translated means Surah of the Spider. It references the fatality of false gods like the fatality of a spiderweb. The other surah is Surah Rum, which prophesied that the Romans that were Christians would defeat the Persians who were idol worshippers at the time. And this in fact did happen. Thus the Muslims were assured that monotheism was the true path. Lastly, Surah Dukhan is recommended. Dukhan means smoke, and this surah references the cloud of smoke that would envelop disbelievers, perhaps on the Day of Judgment. Also in Ramadan, it's customary to recite Dua al-Iftitah. This dua was revealed by our present Imam alayhi salam, for she is to recite every night during the month of Ramadan. It is divided into 2 parts: man's relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and divine leaders. In the first part, the dua discusses the praise of Allah, the oneness or tawheed of Allah, the generosity of Allah, and the relationship of the human to his creator. The emphasis is on Allah as a loving, gracious, and forgiving creator. The second part of the dua discusses praise for the Prophet of Islam, sends blessings on the Masumin, and discusses the role of the 12th Imam alayhi salam. Dua al-Iftitah is not only a prayer for our needs, but a teaching of the roots of faith and a planning for a way of life. On behalf of the Youth Committee of OIL, we wish you an opportunity to recite these surahs and Dua al-Iftitah, and also wish you much peace on these difficult nights.
Thank you, Mikhail. For more than 20 years, Anisa Mehdi worked in mainstream American news media as a broadcast journalist and producer. She has won 2 Emmys, a Cine Golden Eagle, and numerous prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists for reporting on religion and the arts. Her credits include National Geographic, 60 Minutes, PBS, NPR, and ABC News Nightline. Anisa is an alumna of Wellesley College and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. She was a 2009-2010 Fulbright Scholar in Jordan. Please help me in welcoming Anisa Mehdi.
Thank you so much, Kaniz Sivji, for your lovely introduction. My gratitude also to Talib Kizlibash and Hasnain Sajan for inviting me to speak with you this week and for their technical support. Also want to thank Mikhail for centering us with your comments about Imam Ali alayhi salam and the Laylatul Qadr tradition. To you out there in YouTube land, thank you for joining us this last hour or so before iftar. Last night, I introduced myself as a New York City girl of Iraqi and Canadian heritage, of Muslim and Christian upbringing, and as a journalist committed to expanding the story about Muslims and Arabs from what we typically hear in the news media to a more multidimensional perspective that includes culture and diversity, and in particular, hospitality. As the executive director of the Abraham Path Initiative, I get to step out of my reporter role, and I'm no longer an intermediary. Instead, with this organization, I encourage you to have your own experience of the part of the world we call the Middle East. And this is also the part of the world from which so many of our spiritual guides have come, the prophets in whose leadership we trust. Last night, I introduced you to the Abraham Path Initiative, and I'm going to do a little recap on that and take it actually farther and show you some images from the region as we go. So this map again is a map of a geography, not a map of the Middle East, right? This is a map of Southwest Asia, which is the area in the world where Abraham Path Initiative does our work. We are a non-governmental organization that develops, nurtures, and promotes walking trails associated with the legendary travels of Ibrahim and his family. They walked through this part of our planet, western and southwestern part of the Asian continent. Now, many, many great civilizations have come and gone over thousands of years in this area, and borders have been constantly changing. We just don't necessarily think about it that way. In our time, we experience these as horrible wars, and they are, but they have also been the case in the past. And I'm going to name some of the civilizations that have gone by with the borders changing accordingly. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, all in this part of Southwest Asia. And then the Nabateans here in the great city of Petra, which was their capital, and down here in the northern part of what is today Saudi Arabia, Madin Saleh, which was a suburb to Petra. This Petra survived and thrived for 600 years before finally succumbing to financial failure when the Romans decided that sending trade up the land route, right, the land route, was too expensive. So they diverted trade away from Petra, which is where everybody stopped off on their caravan routes, to Gaza, and sent it then by sea out to Rome and Greece. So Petra was financially starved. And then, of course, a series of earthquakes really finished off the dominance of the Nabatean civilization there. This is called the Jordan Rift Valley, and it is where two continents come together. And when they move and rock, just like they do under California, they create earthquakes. In the western part of the territory we're talking about here was the Egyptian pharaonic dynasties for thousands of years. And later came the Ptolemies with Cleopatra. I remember reading in Stacy Schiff's biography of Cleopatra that when she took Mark Antony and Julius Caesar on separate journeys up the Nile River, Schiff noted that neither she nor her guests would have seen the Great Pyramids, those pyramids of Giza that we all think are iconic for Egypt. They wouldn't have seen them. Why? Because they'd been buried in sand already for 1,000 years. It took my breath away to get that kind of information, the perspective on time. So we have in this region, we had those great Egyptian dynasties, and then the Greeks and Romans came through, Julius Caesar and company. Then there was the Byzantine Empire, and then the Islamic Empire, and then the Crusaders came through, and then the Ottomans, and 2 world wars. And you can imagine, if you see the changing of boundaries and borders and fast forward, and there are some programs that do that. I've seen them on YouTube. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. But it puts some perspective on where we are now. So this is the arrangement we have now with these borders and these boundaries. And this is the arrangement in which the Abraham Path does our work, nurturing those walking trails in Sinai. Where is Sinai? Right over here. And in Jordan and in Palestine, both sides of the Jordan River Valley, and in South Central Turkey over here. And certainly under today's geopolitical circumstances, these trails are not going to be connecting. They can't. Some of these countries don't even have diplomatic relations, let alone allow people to walk across bridges. So we don't know. In 100 years, 200 years, things may be different. They may not. It may be a unified walk where you can start somewhere in today's Iraq and travel up the journey where we've located Abraham's stories up into Turkey and then down the Jordan River Valley across Sinai, where the family collected Hagar. We'll talk about her in a moment. And then, of course, down to Mecca, where Abraham and Ismail, his son, raised the foundations of the Kaaba. But while civilizations have come and gone, the mountains remain, and the rivers remain, and the seas and lakes remain, and the hospitable people remain. It brings to mind this wonderful, wonderful passage from the Noble Quran that reads, "From the date palm come clusters of low-hanging dates, and there are gardens of vines, olives, and pomegranates, alike yet different. Watch their fruits as they grow and ripen. In all this, there are signs for those who would believe." This is chapter 6, ayat 99. And what it makes me think about is the people and the land who could be seen as the ripe fruits of this region. They are the descendants and they are the inheritors, and they could be seen as the ripe fruits of this region. And API works together with the people, the ripe fruits, the residents, and the land to cultivate walking trails. Travelers to these trails are another kind of cluster of dates, aren't they? Connecting and sharing stories and learning about one another, ripening the richness of our lives. In fact, there's a story that one of my colleagues told me at one of the homestays in Palestine. And he said, a group of Italians had spent the night at this home. And when my colleague went, the husband, the father in this family said, after the Italians left, my son came to me. My son's 8 years old. And he came and he said, "Daddy, those folks are different from us, right? They They speak a different language. They usually eat pasta, not hummus. They have a different cuisine. They have different clothing, but they were a lot like us. And that's the kind of connection, the kind of learning about one another, the rich ripening of our lives that walking through another person's land and visiting in his home can bring. I've always loved that story. So I'm going to show you a few more pictures of this beautiful, ripely fruited land, just to whet your appetite. So this is climbing one of the large, long hillsides of Palestine. And at that point, it looks like this is me in the blue headscarf. It looks like I'm just chit-chatting with my friend Oliver, and my husband is down there taking a photograph of whoever's taking a photograph of us. But really, we were standing there catching our breath. Every step of going up that hillside, I was saying either Inshallah, Inshallah, Inshallah. I was saying Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. I was saying Labbaik, Allahumma Labbaik. I was saying any chant I could to keep my legs going and keep my thighs from burning. And it's like that in Ramadan, isn't it? Sometimes we do everything we can to keep our word to the Almighty. Here's at the top of that particular hill was the remnants of a shrine to a Sufi sheikh. And we took a moment there to appreciate being at the top and seeing the extraordinary view and noticing that this person lived there and learning that people from the villages below, and this was hundreds of years ago, people from the villages below would walk up every day and bring him food. The hospitality. And this is Palestine in the spring. There's a lot of sandy looking colors and a lot of browns and earth tones, but there's also a lot of beautiful images of flowers. We're moving on here to Jordan, and the contrast again of images. On the one side, the smaller image, you see my colleagues coming down this really gnarly chasm. You can see the folks there coming through. And over here, same group of people a day earlier walking through a valley that had a river in it. It wasn't a big river, but it was a river. And so there's a sign of the diversity. And let's not forget the people and the relationships and the fun you can have getting to know someone, especially if you don't know their language. So here is David Baum, who is now a member of our board, doing a magic trick to make friends. And here is Louise Sibley, a former member of our board, having an intense conversation with a little girl. And I'll bet they probably shared 5 or 6 words in common, but they understood each other. Here's another shot. This is in Petra, and we're learning about the waterway works there, the way that the Nabateans, who I mentioned earlier, would build channels with clay to collect every single drop of water that came in from a 10-mile radius around this city that housed 30,000 people at its height, and how those channels were built so well that we can still see the remnants of them today. And when I think about the shortage of water that's coming our way, I think, boy, we could use some of that technology these days. We could also use someone like Prophet Joseph, who could help us manage to save for 7 years for the famine that's to come. And here's a picture of me with my friend Tamam, who I had met when she was 7 years old. And she's holding a photograph of herself that I brought to her that day, now that she's 16. And we are standing at the famous monastery building at Petra, which is not to be confused with the Treasury, which is even more famous, the one that was in the Indiana Jones movie a number of years ago. Moving on to Sinai. Oh my goodness, can you imagine trekking through here after you'd escaped from Pharaoh and crossed the Red Sea? And now this is what the Almighty puts before you on your road to freedom. This is some of our hikers in 2018 walking down one of those into one of the valleys between the mountains. And this is one of the sights we saw, the depiction of a very ancient battle with riders on camels and riders on horses and long spears and arrows. And alongside that antiquity, we have the very cool Bedouin Musallam Abu Faraj, who was our tour guide. I think he's worth a Hollywood debut. Then, of course, we have our new work in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I mentioned yesterday that the New York Times has just done a nice article about the Abraham Path Initiative, our long-distance hiking trail that we're developing there, and about our colleagues, Leon McCarran and Laween Muhammad, who are just superstars getting this work done. So here are some other images of Iraq. That's a fall image, beautiful lake, stream in the fall. And here is a monastery that dates, the monastery Rabban, Hormizd Rabban, that dates back to the 6th century. And it is built into the side of the mountain there. Final image from Iraq here is the famous Samara. This is the Milwiya. It is a minaret. And the muezzin would have to walk up this spiraling path, not very, very wide at all. I climbed it when I was very much younger, to the top to call the faithful to prayer. And I remember being disheartened when I saw images during the Iraq War of American soldiers on top there with their guns pointing outward. But fortunately, that's not the case anymore. And the people you see here, this one is Leon McCarran, who's doing that work for us and with us in Erbil and in the Kurdistan region. Emily Garthwaite, an award-winning photographer who has also been previously a fellow of the Abraham Path Initiative, and the team they worked with, the Iraqi team that they worked with as they took a boat trip from the head of the Tigris River in Turkey all the way to its mouth south of Basra. And they did that about a year ago. Fascinating journey, and there'll be a film and a book coming out about that. And then here we have Turkey. And I wanted to point this out in particular because there's a beautiful sunset here on this side, but look at this head and how large it is compared to this very tall man, Omar Tanik, who is one of our very close partners in South Central Turkey. This is at a place called Göbekli Tepe. It's 6 miles from Urfa, which is a city that claims it may be the place that Abraham was born, competing there with Ur in today's Iraq. It's the story, and Urfa, I told you, of King Nimrod wanting to kill Abraham because he was proclaiming there was only one God, not many. And so he had him catapulted into a fire, and instead God changed it into a pool of water, which we saw in the film yesterday. But just 6 miles from there is this 11,000-year-old site. Massive carved stones crafted and arranged by prehistoric people who had not yet developed metal tools or even pottery. These megaliths predate Stonehenge by, ready, 6,000 years. And some archaeologists believe this is the site of the world's oldest temple. And I would assert that if Ibrahim were alive then, or when he was alive, if he was born in Urfa, or if he passed through on his journey, he would certainly have heard about this place because it predates all the known stories we have of Ibrahim. All right. And today we are going to start we are going to look more deeply at Ibrahim. And we'll start with a short video that introduces an important part of Ibrahim's story. And it also has a focus on women because we know that women were a very important part of his life, the mothers of his 2 sons, for starters, but certainly in other ways as well. We also had a question yesterday about women in the region and women along the Abraham Path, and this addresses them and that issue too. This film was this this film was made during a walk in the Palestinian countryside in 2017. And we call it a walk talk. You've heard of TED Talks. This is a walk talk. And I'm hoping that the video will run smoothly, and I'm really hopeful that the audio is great so that you can hear what I have to say about Ibrahim and women in the region.
As I walk through these hills, I can't help but think that I'm part of a lineage of walkers, going back thousands of years. And I think among them of Ibrahim. I think of Isaac and Ismail. I think of Jacob. I think of Moses and Jesus and Muhammad. May God's blessings be on all of them. And I think too that we remember the men and the story of the men, but with them always were women. Who was milking the goats? Who was baking the bread? Who was making it possible for Ibrahim to invite people into his tent and offer the hospitality that is so welcome here and so much a part of the DNA of the people who live here today? So I want to talk just briefly about one of those women who's inspired me so much from the past. And that was a young Egyptian who joined up with Abraham and Sarah. The rabbis of the 1st and 2nd century believed that Hagar was the daughter of Pharaoh, who sent her with Abraham so that she could live in the family of believers. And I like to call her the first lady of monotheism, because when she became second wife to Abraham so that she could have a child for Sarah, because she couldn't bear a child at that time, she and Sarah got in a bit of a tiff. And she ran away crying. And God spoke to her, the story says, and said, "Have faith, Hagar. You will have a son, and his name will be Ismail, which means God listens. And he will be the father of a great nation," which is a promise that God made also, they say, to Abraham about both of his sons. And she went back and she was faithful. And when she had her son, and then Sarah had her son, and the families split, Abraham sent her to what is today Mecca. And as she worried and cried to God to give water for her son, and the well sprang forward, she now, a newcomer to the community that became Mecca, has agency. She is the owner of a well, the well of Zamzam. At the end of her life, she was the only person, when she passed, the only person to be buried at Mecca at the site of the Kaaba. And she's just one of many, many women, the Marys and Sarah and Miriam, sister of Moses, who made it possible. And today, on this cultural route of Ibrahim, we meet women all the time who are working hard, who are welcoming us into their homes, who are making wonderful meals, who are making wonderful crafts. And I want us to remember that when we think women in this region are marginalized or oppressed, that there's a long legacy of participation and leadership.
So, some food for thought for you there. Let me just make a note. You've noticed that I use the term legendary, and they say, I use those terms a lot when I refer to Ibrahim and his family in these stories, and I mean no offense with that. However, and we know that that these are important stories, and they come from significant sources such as scripture. However, archaeologists and anthropologists have not identified evidence of the life of Ibrahim. All of the all we have are stories. And as I said yesterday, remember, a lie can make it halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. What's important is what we do with these stories, right? That's what's important. And truly, the story of Ibrahim and his family is worth a Hollywood film, or maybe Bollywood. It's a harrowing tale of travel to unknown places and dramatic trials of faith. It's a family saga of love and heartbreak, of adopted and biological sons. We encounter envy, banishment, near death by starvation, heroic motherhood, and an absentee father. There's even the intervention of Lord God Almighty. One would think the script writer for this was Steven Spielberg or Aaron Sorkin. But for ages, scholars and diplomats, Sunday school teachers and peacemakers and politicians have used the Abraham family drama to explain why we can't or don't get along. Why Israelis and Palestinians feud. Why Jews and Muslims butt heads. They excuse our contemporary hostilities by citing the seeds that were planted in the narrative of Abraham, ignoring its core theme of reconciliation. Some scholars malign the key characters to discredit them and their progeny and any special claim to have the ear of the Almighty. You know, if you've noticed, Hagar and Ishmael disappear rather quickly from Genesis once Isaac is born. But there are so many themes of reconciliation here. Hagar reconciling to herself that she can go back and be part of the family when she when she expresses her impertinence towards Sarah while she was pregnant. In the Bible, that scene is a buildup to Abraham banishing her and her son Ishmael once Isaac is born. But in Islamic tradition, it is God that tells Abraham to take Hagar and Ishmael to what is today's Mecca, where the father and son together raised the foundations of the Kaaba. Importantly, in the Bible and in Islamic tradition, these boys come together to bury their father. So this story may be used as an explanation for enmity, but it's really a story of reconciliation. And stories don't have power because they're true or not. They have power because of what we do with them. So what do you do with the story of Abraham? A man that believes God wants him to kill his son. What lessons do you take from Hagar's impertinence and her courage to go on? When things go wrong, how do you right them? Do you muscle your way out? Or are you patient to a fault, waiting for God? But surely you must not simply sit by and wait. God does not change the condition of a people until they change their own condition, is written in the Quran, chapter 13, verse 11. Scholars have tried to sort out the story of Abraham for centuries. I've read research claiming that Sarah was a priestess. She was of royalty and she was a priestess. And that Hagar was a princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, who was placed into Ibrahim's family because her father wanted her to grow to know the one God, even though she came from a culture that believed in many. We ask, what kind of father tries to kill his son? What kind of God asks for that? These are all great questions we take from the life of Ibrahim. And what do we do with them? In the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 1-3, God orders Abraham to leave his idol-worshiping father and his home country and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. He also tells Abraham that his family will be great. And he tells him that story about both of his sons. The Quran tells the same story of Abraham leaving home a bit differently. In chapter 21:15, we bestowed right judgment on Abraham, and we knew him well. He said to his father and his people, "What are these images to which you're so devoted?" And you all know the rest of that story. Abraham breaks the idols with his own hammer and then puts the blame on the biggest idol by putting the hammer into that statue's hand. He said, he did it. And the people, were not pleased with that logic. In Palestine, I recently saw a painted wall that said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. But that was apropos. Forgive me if I've used a bad word. God tells Abraham in the Quran, chapter 2, 124, I will make you a leader of people. And Abraham asks, and will you make leaders from my descendants too? So in the Bible, God is offering this leadership to Abraham. But in the Quran, God qualifies his answer. My pledge does not hold for those who do evil, putting the onus on us to keep doing good whenever we can. So this is a good lead-in to talking about the Hajj. The key event after the day of Arafat is to stone the devil. It's an event called the Jamrat. It's the story of Ibrahim believing that God told him to sacrifice his son, and then facing the devil who is tempting him not to do so. 3 times, Satan questions Abraham, and 3 times Ibrahim chases him away with stones. It is the Hajji's opportunity at this Jamrat to take a stand against temptations that face the Hajji every day of his or her life, and throwing stones to reject that temptation. Some of you have been there, right? You're remembering this. Well, I've covered the Hajj now 3 times. First in 1998, the second in 2003, and a third in 2014. In 1998, I was the first American actually to go to Mecca as a reporter for television and do a story. Then in 2003, I made a documentary, and in 2014, another documentary, full hour-long films. I've edited together the Jamrat scenes from each of them, so you can see how people participate. You can see how the physical place of the Jamrat has changed in these past 25 years, and get a sense of the power in this ritual, no matter what the scenery looks like. I'll stop the playback a couple of times during it to tell you some stories and suggest what you should focus on, and then we'll talk. Okay? Give me just a moment here. Come on. All right, we're going to start in 1998. This is the PBS Religion and Ethics News Weekly, which sent me to Mecca to cover the Hajj. It had never been done before to have an American reporter producer on location. And I had to find the person who was going to tell this story out of the 7,000 Americans who were traveling that year to make the Hajj. I called everyone I knew. And finally, a good friend of mine in town said, my daughter has a friend in gymnastics class, and her dad is going on Hajj. Maybe you want to talk to him. So I did. And he, Abdul Alim Mubarak, was the perfect pilgrim for me to report on, for me to cover, for me to profile. He knew why he was going. He had felt a call to go that year. He is an American who speaks beautiful English and could be understood quite easily by our American PBS audience. And I was there for a moment saying, wait a minute, could it be this easy that the right person out of 7,000 lives a mile away from me? And then I thought, this is a blessing from God. You take this. And I'll tell you, God has given me many blessings in my experiences covering the Hajj pilgrimage. Maybe I'll share a few more of them with you tonight. But here is our 1998 reporting of the Jamrat part of the Hajj for Abdul Alim Mubarak.
Almost done with the rituals now. All that's left is to stone the devil. Pilgrims act out another episode in Abraham's life. According to the Quran, when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, Ishmael, Satan tried to get him not to. Abraham drove Satan away with stones.
We are also stoning the devils in our own lives because we're always tempted by the devil every single moment of our lives, inwardly, outwardly.
You feel them raining on your back of your heads, the pebbles?
You know, it's really funny. I had a kufi on, right? And it's good to wear a kufi because you felt something coming on your head. Even when I was really concerned, I almost fell back and I almost lost my glasses and I almost stumbled and fell into the crowd. And for a brief moment, you know, I thought, okay, this may be it. You know, Allah knows best.
We'll stop Abdul right there for just a minute. You saw the obelisk. That was the object representing Satan in 98. It looks entirely different in 2003. It's so much different that we wrote it to be called a spiritual superhighway rather than this much more simple place. You saw Abdul, you didn't see him because we couldn't follow him into the Jamrat in 1998. We couldn't go in there. It was, our cameras were too big. It was mayhem and chaotic. So we had him tell us the story afterwards, which is what you're hearing now. And we used archive footage to show what was happening for the people. The person I focus on in the next section, which is the National Geographic film that I did in 2003 called Inside Mecca, is another American. She's a professor of neuroscience, and she is of Irish descent. She and her friend have just left Muzdalifah, having collected the stones they need for this ritual of stoning the devil. And they are heading to the pillars. Oh, well, that didn't work. Hang on. Whoops. Well, what would it be if we didn't have some technical difficulties? Almost there. Okay, getting closer. All right, we start with the overview of the place. Look at that. You see what it looked like.
They know that in the next 24 hours, 2 million pilgrims will converge at one of the most dangerous intersections of the Hajj, the largest of the 3 stone pillars. When God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, most Muslims believe it was Ishmael, the elder son. In the Bible story, it was Isaac. Either way, it would have been agonizing for Abraham.
He started having some doubts, and he realized that these doubts were really coming from the whisperings of Satan. We don't know exactly what Satan would have said, but it was something like, "What do you think you're doing, killing your son? Are you crazy?" He gets very angry and he throws a stone at Satan and gets rid of him one time, and then Satan comes back again because it's his job to misguide people. And the third time he comes again and he threw another stone. So there are these 3 stoning points that during Hajj people reenact.
The ritual is called the Jumrat. In days to come, they'll stone all 3 pillars.
This is now a moral statement that the believer affirms that there is good and evil. There is justice and injustice. There is righteousness and sinfulness.
I loved the Jamrat. I thought as a ritual, it has tremendous power, and my training is in neuroscience. The more ways, physically, mentally, spiritually, verbally, the more ways that you try to contain the evil and the temptation, then I think the more effective it's bound to be. I thought, from a scientific point of view, that was a really good ritual.
All right, so from a scientific point of view, I told you she was a professor of neuroscience. We take our next visit to the Jamrat in it's actually the Hajj of 2013, but it came on air in 2014 in a series called Sacred Journeys. This is a PBS series, and it was a 5-hour series on pilgrimage in the human tradition. And I was pegged, I guess, for my expertise there to be the producer and director and correspondent in the episode on the Hajj, because the show host, Bruce Feiler, was not permitted to go and attend the Hajj because he wasn't Muslim. But he was present in all of the other films. And I urge you to look for these films. Some of them are on YouTube. You can find them. Inside Mecca from National Geographic was actually, I was told, its hottest selling educational film for years. And I would meet people all over who would say, oh yeah, I've used that in my comparative religion class. I've used that for my high school students. I've used that for global studies in my 7th grade class. So it's been a great honor for me to have made that kind of contribution. Here we go with the next clip, which is the stoning of the devil. It starts out actually here with show host Bruce Feiler laying out the full story of Abraham for the PBS audience. That leads to the ritual stoning, and it starts from the Valley of Muzdalifah.
They'll spend the night in the Valley of Muzdalifah before reenacting Abraham's dramatic showdown with Satan. In a barren strip of desert like this, Abraham faces his greatest test. In a dream, the Quran says, Abraham sees himself sacrificing his son, believing it's a message from God. The devil tempts him to disobey, the commentators added. But Abraham defies the devil and declares his loyalty to God. Judaism and Christianity also commemorate Abraham's willingness to sacrifice a son. But Islam teaches that Abraham gathers stones and throws them at the devil in defiance. Pilgrims do the same.
I am now arming myself for the challenge that is coming, that I will meet Satan, and he will tempt me as he tempted our father, Abraham.
Here is the immediacy of being on the road. You don't just read the story, or tell it, or sing it. You act it, you become it. You enter the story, gathering ammunition to throw at whatever it is that's tempting you.
It is a physical embodiment of something that you're constantly struggling with yourself. When we go back to our homes, leaving this holy place, how do we now go and stone, if you will, those urges that really are not, abiding by the way of Allah? And that's really what the significance is.
More surprising is that a story that invokes child sacrifice continues to resonate at all.
You would think that this story is so barbaric that it would have died out over time. What is it about this story?
I don't want anybody to get the idea that this is about a homicide, that God came in and stopped it. The moral of the story is that God already knew when he asked Abraham that he was going to step in.
It was just a test. It was a test of, do you trust God more than anything else? And he was willing to do that, like no questions asked. And, we're just doing this to represent that sacrifice. And sacrifice without question is something that, in this day and age, we don't really get ourselves involved in, right?
It's early morning of the 3rd day since leaving Mecca. The pilgrims move on to the penultimate stage of the Hajj, returning to Mina carrying their pebbles to stone the devil, which they'll do again and again. Another vast multi-level building stands where Abraham is said to have confronted the devil. At the center of the building, 3 massive stone pillars. Today, they're more like walls that symbolize Satan.
It is symbolic, but it's also real. Because you are in that place. You're surrounded by stone. It's desolate, and that's where God is with you. and the Satan that you can't see, but he's always around, inviting you against your best interests.
Once again, the pilgrims reenact the past, a reminder that everyone faces temptations every day.
It's a way to say I have control over Shaitan. I can actually push Satan away, and I can actually take charge of the situation.
The size and shape of the pillars have changed radically over time. The current structure was built in 2006 to protect pilgrims from being crushed and trampled, as happened frequently in the past. The evolution of this pillar is quite visually interesting. Okay, so originally we have a kind of small...
like an obelisk.
Yeah, exactly. Then it evolves, and then you've got, it's a little taller, to today, where you've got this whole wall.
The importance is not what is the shape of the pillar. It is, I am in the place of Abraham, and I am doing what Abraham did. And by the way, I like the way they changed the structure, because the obelisk, if you are on the opposite side and somebody missed the pillar, then you get hit with the pebble.
Today is Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice, when Muslims worldwide celebrate the saving of Abraham's son, often by sacrificing an animal. These days, pilgrims pay for a sacrifice to be done in their name, the meat given to the poor. Pilgrims change out of ihram, some men shave their heads, and all return to the pillars to complete the stoning.
You perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, you give up your familiar. You give up your lifestyle, your diet, your clothing, lipstick. You give up the things that are part of you. 7 pebbles, 7 circuits around the Kaaba, 7 days in the week, 7 heavens. There's something about that 7, and there's something about repetition for people. Once it's become habit forming, then maybe when you go back, you'll be able to practice. People get worked up because the fervor, the feeling is there that I'm letting some of my baggage go. Satan, you broke up my family. Satan, you caused me to lose my job. Satan, my child. We're in a group therapy. We're all getting it out.
The throwing of the rocks, I almost didn't go because I really did not think of it as anything significant, almost even silly. But I went, and the first one I was throwing rocks as if I was throwing them at my own flaws. And the second one, I found myself asking for strength to overcome those. And then the last one, I found myself feeling so alive, so happy that God is stronger than any of those stupid things that we give into. So it was really enlivening for me.
The pilgrims that you're with, if you had to guess, what's the one thing they're taking home?
They're taking home that their life is in God's hands, but still do the best you can. It doesn't mean sit back and wait. Sometimes the hurdles along the way are what make the journey valuable.
What do you get by going on a journey like this that you don't get by staying home?
You have to leave home to see what is out there in the world. And in many of the countries from which these people come, there are wars going on. And yet, here you see people who are working together to generate a community that crosses all kinds of boundaries.
Allah created human beings in the best mold. And when you see them on Hajj, they are, with all of their difficulties, on their best human behavior. If human beings, year after year, decade after decade, millennia after millennia, can do that, then it means there is hope for humanity.
We're very close to the top of the hour.
Yeah, thank you, Anissa. That was great. The time just flew by today. I couldn't believe how engrossed I was in the stories and feeling, the connection that you're exactly talking about. Why don't we try to get to a couple questions, if that's all right with you?
Let's do that.
So there was one from yesterday that I thought was a good one. So you told us about how you grew up in a multi-faith home. Do you find that there were some parallels between your experience, the experience of Abraham, and the reconciliation that had to take place? And almost, were there parts of that experience that actually led you to do the work that you're doing now?
Yes. What a provoking question. I'd always thought the work I'm doing now I was led to it because I was fending off the discrimination against Arabs that I saw in television. Every time something happened, an act of terrorism, we were all labeled terrorists. And yet, indeed, as I contemplate this right now, there is something about this insistence on keeping our religious traditions separate and arguing about, who God loves the most and who owns Abraham and which prophet was the most important, that I'd like to see some kind of reconciliation there too. Because there was in my family between my parents, no argument, really. And it's weird because I'm not sure either of them really believed in God. They left it up to us. We needed to be educated about these traditions, but we didn't have to believe. And I got to choose my belief. But I didn't see an argument that was worth arguing between Christianity and Islam. You believe Jesus is divine. I don't. Are you a good person? Are you doing the right thing? Mm-hmm. And those questions keep returning.
And
so thank you for that insight.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And that must be a similar story of reconciliation that you see between real people, between parties that are involved in, the work that you're doing on the path, but also the people that participate either in organizing or working on developing them, or the hosts. Are there any stories of unlikely partnerships that you've seen on the path or in your experience?
I think everyone who goes is somewhat self-selected. If you're going to go on a hike in the Middle East, we'll call it the Middle East for the political overtones that it has, you have to have a certain amount of courage, resolve, and open-mindedness to begin with. But even I find myself having breakthroughs in understanding how I relate to people. And I think I'm tremendously open-minded, the sin of hubris. But one thing that I saw on this last trip, which surprised me, was and made me happy. One of our walkers was a specialist in fragrances and had worked, with, I don't know which of the companies, but Chanel and all of those fragrance companies. And we went to visit the Bethlehem Fair Trade Artisans Organization in Bethlehem. And the woman who owns it, Suzanne, was saying that she'd like to branch out into making really high quality fair trade products for people. How you can get little shampoos and stuff in hotels. Well, she wanted to bring a bigger market to the 1,000 Palestinian artisans that participate in the Palestinian Fair Trade Association, who get paid properly, have good working conditions, and all of the requirements that you have to have in order to be labeled fair trade. And they started talking, and he brought her some ideas, and she came back to him, and it was an interesting partnership with his assisting her to bring this product to market. Now, that only started to 2 months ago, so we haven't seen anything to market yet, but it was that kind of engagement that really excited me, the kind of possibility of what might come of unlikely meetings.
That's great. So there are 2 or 3 more questions, but I think what we'll do is we'll save them for tomorrow in hopes that the person that posted them or the people that posted them come back tomorrow. Some really good ones. So I will actually prep you on them, Anissa, before we meet in the evening, so you can have some preparation. But just a couple things. I did want to tell the audience that we do have a link to all of Anissa's work on our website. So if you go to islamiclearning.org and go to programs, on the event for today, under Anissa's biography, we have a link to more about her, and that lists all of her work that we have the ability to link to. The other thing that I wanted to tell you, Anissa, is that the article, you just briefly touched on the New York Times article, but the imagery in that article is breathtaking. I want to share that with everyone, and please ask you to go and look at that and view the photos and read the story there. We will also link that on our website as well, so that it's fantastic. I'm so drawn into those photos. They're just beautiful.
It's a beautiful part of the world.
Yeah. All right. Well, on behalf of the board, it is with gratitude that I extend my appreciation to everyone listening or watching the recording. Again, if you'd like to learn more about the Abraham Path Initiative, please visit abrahampath.org. If you'd like to support the API and Anissa's team throughout Southwest Asia, please click donate on her site. And to you, Anissa, we're grateful for your time and for your inspiration, and again, for your work to spread the true essence of Islam. Lastly, events like this are only possible through generous donations. Please consider a small donation through OIL's website, islamiclearning.org. And thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening.